Chapter 19 to 20. Shirou and Sakura made their way along the escape route that had been carefully planned in advance. "Big brother, your hand." Sakura's tears were flowing freely, and she couldn't hide her worry. "Let's not talk about that now. We'll talk about it when we get home," Shirou replied, shaking his head. They were still in the Matu family's sphere of influence, and he didn't want to risk attracting attention by discussing his injury. He was focused on getting them both to safety and didn't want to waste energy worrying about other things. Shirou couldn't help but wonder about the sword that had appeared earlier, wondering if it had been the helpful Mr. Gold who had taken action. It seemed strange to him that the self-centered king who pursued pleasure would extend a helping hand to him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there must be some other reason behind the king's actions. Shirou shook his head and decided not to dwell on these thoughts. He knew that Mr. Gold had his own unique values, and it would be crazy to judge his actions based on normal logic or the values of ordinary people. It was best to leave it at that, and not try to understand the motivations of someone who was so far outside the norm. As long as the outcome was good, that was enough. Although he had lost 2 arms. No, it wasn't accurate to say that he had lost them. His right hand was paralyzed due to an overloaded magic circuit, while his left hand was fractured and suffering from muscle spasms due to blocking Spartacus's attack. Despite the severe pain in both of his arms, Shirou knew that this meant that he still had sensation and that his arms weren't lost. However, after this battle, Shirou realized that even though he had merged with his Saint Graf and become a demi-servant, he still had a chance against magicians. But going up against proper servants would be suicide. If it weren't for Mr. Gold's intervention, even if he had indirectly managed to weaken Spartacus's attack, he still would have been crushed. The only way to survive the Fourth Holy Grail War is to leave, Shirou decided. He knew that once they left Fuyuki City, he would have to use suggestion to make his family go out and play for a year, in order to keep them safe from the troubles of 1994. Shirou knew that he would have to sacrifice his father's job in order to keep himself and his family safe. He knew that even in the midst of an economic recession, there would be job opportunities, but there was only one life, and it was more important to protect that. It was a difficult decision, but one that Shirou was willing to make in order to ensure their safety. Shirou and Sakura were making their way out of the small grove of trees outside the Matu residence when, out of nowhere, a sea of flames appeared in front of them, blocking their way. "There seems to be a problem at the Matu residence. Could you please put the young lady down, Magus?" a voice asked from within the flames. It was Tokiomi, who emerged from the inferno like a gentleman. Tokiomi had already left the Matu residence when he heard the explosion and received a warning from Gilgamesh, who was nearby. He immediately turned around and drove back, arriving just in time to meet Shirou and Sakura as they were trying to escape. Aoi stood next to the car, looking at Sakura with concern written all over her face. "This won't do," Shirou said as he stepped in front of Sakura, trying to protect her. He deliberately lowered his voice, knowing that it was the only part of him that wasn't disguised. He had done his best to change his appearance, but there were no voice changers available at the department store. "It's not befitting of a magus to kidnap a young lady while hiding in the shadows," Tosaka said, feeling strange about the situation. He knew that he wasn't dead yet. Sakura was still young and should be under the protection of the Tosaka family, so the clock tower shouldn't have placed a sealing designation on her. This led him to the conclusion that the person in front of him was a stray who had come out of nowhere. "That's better than a father who abandons his children," Shirou replied, intentionally leading Tosaka to misunderstand his true identity. "That is not up to you to say," Tosaka Tokiomi replied, carrying the elegance of a noble to the end. "If you don't want to make an enemy of the Tosaka family, please return my daughter to me." "Liar." Before Shirou could speak, Sakura muttered under her breath. "Sakura?" Tokiomi was momentarily startled. "You're all liars," Sakura exclaimed, mustering up the courage to speak out. She raised her head and looked at Tosaka and Aoi, tears streaming down her face. "You're not my dad and she's not my mum. You're all liars. My dad and mum are already gone." Tosaka was momentarily stunned by Sakura's words, but he quickly recovered his neutral, elegant demeanor. "Sakura, It is normal for you not to understand now, but all of this is love from your parents. You will be happy in the future because of our choices. Happy? Love? Sakura couldn't comprehend how Tosaka could speak of happiness and love in the face of the fear, terror, and despair that she had experienced in the basement. The man and woman who had willingly sent her to that hell were no longer the loving parents of her memories. Tears flowed freely from her eyes as she struggled to come to terms with the betrayal. I don't have a father. I don't have a mother. I am not a child of the Tosaka family. Tokiomi and Aoi stood frozen in shock, as if they had been struck by lightning. The once weak and clever, obedient and sensible child eventually returned these words to her parents who had abandoned her. In the end, it was the parents who were abandoned by their children. Betrayers will eventually be betrayed, mutually inflicting suffering and torment upon each other. It's truly a delightful play. Perched atop a distant tree, the king surveyed the land with a satisfied gaze, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth as his eyes sparkled with pleasure. It's a shame, Tokiomi of the Tosaka family. There's no sign of your daughter here. You can either leave or let me send you on your way. Shirou projected a long sword using his still functional left arm and pointed it at Tokiomi. Tokiomi, whose noble manners were deeply ingrained, quickly regained his composure. He looked calmly at Shirou and said, "The child is still young and doesn't understand, but if you dare to kidnap my daughter, then you are an enemy of the Tosaka." Tokiomi swung his staff and summoned a tidal wave of flames with his surging magical energy. However, before he could unleash them, Shirou had already launched his attack. He hurled the long sword in his hand and activated Broken Phantasm, causing the blade to explode with a blinding burst of light that was too intense for the human eye to withstand. Tokiomi reflexively closed his eyes in response. When he opened them again, the only thing he could see were the shoes growing larger and larger in his field of vision. Thud! The sound of the impact echoed through the air. Shirou stepped on Tokiomi's face and used the momentum to escape the sea of flames. Tokiomi was filled with shame and anger. "Damn it!" he cursed. Even the manners of a noble were difficult to maintain in the face of such an embarrassing action. No, perhaps it was because he was a noble, but the dignity within him couldn't bear such shame. But Shirou and Sakura had already run far away, and Tokiomi didn't have the courage to use heavy force against them. Instead, he stirred up a wave of heat and used the wind to reveal Shirou's true appearance, planning to settle the score at a later time. Rattle, rattle. As the cloak was thrown off, Shirou's true appearance was revealed as it should have been. However, what Tokiomi saw was the legendary giant from the Land of Light, the leather suit of Ultraman 7. Tokiomi was confused. Shirou's all-around concealment had an effect. He ignored Tokiomi's confusion and ran away with Sakura. Passing by Aoi, Shirou didn't even look at her. Only Sakura looked at her, at that woman, at the woman called Mother, tears blinding her eyes. Aoi froze, completely frozen. The already painful heart of a mother became even more painful at that moment. Of particular importance was the fact that Aoi saw the blood and wounds on Sakura's body. Those wounds were not inflicted by a blade. What happened? What exactly happened in such a short moment? Aoi doesn't know. She can only wonder what happened to her daughter. Her heart breaks even more at the thought. Tokiomi wanted to chase after Shirou and Sakura, but at that moment, the distant voice of Matu Byakuya, filled with anger and shame, called out to him. "Damn it! Tosaka Tokiomi, even if you don't want to continue the family succession, what do you mean by letting your servants sneak attack us, the Matu family?" Byakuya questioned, his voice filled with anger. The swarm of insects driven by Zuken followed behind him. However, upon seeing Tokiomi, Byakuya realized something and his heart skipped a beat. He quickly ordered the insects to burrow underground and hide. But it was too late. Tokiomi had already seen everything. As a magus, he understood. He understood. He was more aware of why Sakura would be so angry. The Matu family's magic has actually degenerated into insect magic, Tokiomi exclaimed, filled with shame and anger. The shoe print on his face had not yet disappeared, and his eyes were full of rage. "Give me an explanation, Tosaka Tokiomi," Matu Byakuya angrily questioned. "You are the ones who need to give me an explanation," Tokiomi said, his anger palpable. If I had known that your Matu family's crest had become such an ugly, inferior, stinking form of insect magic, I would have sent Sakura to Finland long ago. You! Byakuya was extremely angry. He acted as the puppet head of the Matu family, because he could recklessly enjoy the family's wealth. But Gilgamesh's attack had nearly killed him, and he couldn't bear it. The deal had been mutually beneficial, but now he was filled with anger. "Spartacus, kill him!" Byakuya shouted. Oh, it's the oppressor!" Even though he was still under the strong effect of the command seal, Spartacus was much happier this time. He charged toward Tokiomi with cheerful laughter, a blooming smile on his face. However, before he even reached halfway, 4 large shields descended from the sky, trapping him like a cage and halting his progress. "Mongrel, this is how a mongrel should look," said an arrogant voice. Everyone looked up to see Gilgamesh standing atop a tree, looking down on all beings with arrogant eyes. "Your Majesty, allow them to experience the punishment of the King of Heroes," Tokiomi shouted, his voice filled with guilt for his deceived daughter and anger at being deceived. Despite his emotional state, he still maintained the etiquette of a noble. This noble demeanor had become so deeply ingrained in him that it had penetrated his bones and entered his soul. However, in response to Tokiomi's request, Gilgamesh merely chuckled haughtily and turned away, completely ignoring him. Tokiomi's hands shook with anger as he thought about using all of his seals to kill the Matu family, and then letting the haughty king commit suicide. But he suppressed these thoughts, knowing that he needed to fulfill the long-held wish of the Tosaka family and his own desire to reach Akasha. With the king having already left, Tokiomi knew he couldn't face Berserker Spartacus alone. He grabbed Aoi and fled in the car, leaving behind only Matu Byakuya, filled with anger and frustration, and Spartacus, still trapped within the shield. "Find it! We must find it! That is this old man's, my eternal life!" Matu Zuken erupted in anger. Gilgamesh stands atop the tallest tower in Fuyuki City, gazing out at the land below. The cold moonlight bathes his angelic face. Fervor, contemplation, emotions that should not be present in the all-powerful King of Heroes, yet they burn brightly in his blood-red eyes. That soul, that mottled soul, filled with debris, emanating such a revolting stench. There is no doubt that it is nothing but a mongrel soul. But the fire that burns within it is fierce, the fire of a mongrel burning fiercely, burning with a light that has never been seen before. And behind that light, there is a possibility, however small, that it is something he once strived for. From wise king to tyrant, from happily sharing everything with the people to selfishly hoarding everything for himself, there lies the thing he initially sought. Just a possibility, a minuscule probability smaller than grains of sand. But it is enough. As long as there is a possibility, it is enough. The entertainment of punishing thieving scum has come to an end. However, that mottled soul in its small and fragile body is too weak to withstand my glory. Eyes slightly narrowed, Gilgamesh wears a pleased smile. Wearing an Ultraman leather suit, Shirou pulled Sakura's hand and rushed towards the direction of Fuyuki City. This was the Fuyuki Bridge connecting Fuyuki City to Miyama. The pedestrians on the road couldn't help but turn their heads and look at Shirou's Ultraman outfit with curiosity. At this time, the otaku culture had not yet emerged, and cosplay was still a new thing. Shirou ignored these gazes, and after successive battles, his 6-year-old body was unable to bear the burden, leaving him mentally exhausted and without the energy to care about the gaze of the crowd. At this time, Sakura stopped walking. "What's wrong, Sakura?" Shirou turned to look at her. Sakura squatted down, her hands covering her pretty face, tears flowing down her palms. "What should I do? What should I do? She must be afraid and also very painful, right?" Shirou couldn't sit idly by and do nothing. A 5-year-old girl should be enjoying her childhood, receiving her parents' love, but instead she was ultimately abandoned by her parents and indirectly pushed into that hellish nest. She must be very afraid. Shirou paused and hugged her, speaking softly and soothingly. "Don't be afraid, I'm here. Brother is here." Sakura also hugged him back, hot tears rolling down her face and onto Shirou's shoulder. "What should I do? What should I do, brother? Daddy, Mommy, they don't want me anymore. No one wants me anymore. No one will not want you. After all, Sakura is so cute and well-behaved. And even if everyone else doesn't want Sakura, brother will always, always protect Sakura." Shirou spoke softly. "Really?" Sakura stopped crying and looked at Shirou with teary eyes. "Let's make a promise." Shirou held out his right little finger. Sakura hooked her left pinky onto it. "We'll hang by a hook for 100 years, and if we break this promise, we'll have to swallow 1,000 needles." As they spoke, they pressed their two big thumbs together. The promise was established. Seeing that Sakura was no longer crying and looked somewhat relieved, Shirou stood up and smiled. "Let's go home." "But do I still have a home?" "Of course you do. Aunt Chio and Uncle Narita are all waiting for you. Won't they hate me?" "Of course not, they love you very much." Shirou brought Sakura home. Of course, he couldn't just go home like this, so he first jumped to the second floor, entered through the window, took off his Ultraman costume and hid it under the bed, then put on a long shirt to cover his injured arm, and then jumped back to the first floor and entered through the front door. "This child, you didn't even say a word before going out and only came back so late. Where did you go?" Mrs. Fujimaru scolded Shirou with a worried expression, twisting his ear with one hand. "I went to see Sakura," Shirou said dejectedly. His suggestion had only lasted one night and was now useless. If he had known, he would have made it last longer. "Sakura?" "Yes, Sakura will continue to live with us." The Tosaka family agreed. "Is that so? That's great." Mrs. Fujimaru's eyes lit up as she looked at Sakura behind Shirou. Aunt Chio, hello. I'm sorry to bother you from now on." Sakura hesitated a little, but still greeted her politely. "It's no bother at all." Mrs. Fujimaru hugged Sakura and smiled. "Stay with Aunt Chio for as long as you want." Mrs. Fujimaru accepted Sakura warmly. Although Mr. Fujimaru had some concerns about the Tosaka family, when he heard that the Tosaka family had agreed, he didn't think much about it. "You two come in and eat. I made tempura today," Mrs. Fujimaru said. As usual, your cooking is inedible." Shirou took a taste and gave a true evaluation. A tick mark appeared on Mrs. Fujimaru's forehead, and then with a thud, she smacked the newspaper she had rolled onto the table. "Is it good?" Mrs. Fujimaru smiled kindly. Shirou sneered. Did he look like the kind of person who would be threatened by violence? What a joke. "Good, good, it's no wonder you're my mother, the beautiful warrior known as the saint of the kitchen." Shirou put on a flattering smile. Mrs. Fujimaru turned to Sakura and asked, "Sakura, is it good?" "It's delicious. Aunt Chio, if you have time, please teach me." Sakura put down her chopsticks and said earnestly, "Of course." Mrs. Fujimaru smiled brightly. The night was peaceful. Everyone was happy. After dinner, Mr. Fujimaru announced that his work was coming to an end, and he could sign the contract in a few days. He then announced that they were going on a family trip. Shirou was the first to clap and cheer at this news. Not only would they be able to go out and have fun, but they would also be able to avoid the Fourth Holy Grail War. And when they were out, they wouldn't have to worry about the Matu or Tosaka families coming to demand their children back. It was a win-win situation. Exhausted from the day's events, Shirou retired to bed after dinner. He had a relaxing bath and slipped into a comfortable Doraemon pajama before climbing into bed. Just as he was settling in, Sakura appeared at the door. "What's wrong, Sakura?" Shirou had to climb out of his bed again and look at her. The third room on the second floor had already been emptied and decorated in a very girly way. It was assigned to Sakura. But now Sakura was standing at the door of Shirou's room. I'm scared." Sakura's legs shook and she hesitated to ask, "Brother, can I sleep with you?" The child must have been scared by today's events. Shirou nodded and said, "Of course." He welcomed Sakura. Sakura laughed and then climbed into Shirou's bed. She lay on her side, looking at Shirou with a pair of eyes similar to Rin's deep green. "Brother." "What?" Shirou asked. Sakura didn't answer, but opened her arms and hugged Shirou's waist, then pressed her face against Shirou's chest. "Well, it's really the cycle of heaven and earth, and now he must face the retribution." Previously, he used Sakura as a pillow, but now Sakura was using him as a pillow. Shirou shook his head and didn't say anything, but pressed the light on the bedside table. "Good night." "Good night, brother." The pillow is back. Even if he pushed the blame on the ideal, he still saved Sakura in reality and completed his own adventure. The problem that had been avoided was solved, and Mr. Fujimaru's work was also coming to an end, ready to leave Fuyuki City and escape the Fourth Holy Grail War. In this way, the crisis of life was also lifted, and tonight will surely be a good dream. However, the dream was pitch black, and a seductive blood moon hung in the sky. There was an almost tangible black mist around him, and the faint sound of ghostly whispers could be heard. The ground was a bizarre field of ominous flowers. In front of Shirou stood a purple-haired girl, holding a pair of spears and smiling at him like an older sister next door. "So that's how it is," she said. "A special being like this. No wonder." "Nice to meet you," she continued. "I am the mistress of this kingdom. My name is Skathatch. You can also call me Skathatch Sensei."